president of Praxis, and I'd like to welcome you to our last lecture of the semester. We're really excited that you guys are here with us today. Before Dr. Coyne begins, I'd just like to say a few things about his background. Dr. Coyne is a F.A. Harper Professor of Economics at George Mason University. He's the Director of Graduate Studies for the Department of Economics there as well. Furthermore, Dr. Coyne is the Director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center. He's also the co-editor of the Review of Austrian Economics and the co-editor of the Independent Review and the book review editor of Public Choice. Dr. Coyne received his Bachelor of Science from Manhattan College, then earned his Master's and PhD in Economics from George Mason University. He is also the author of two books, After War, The Political Economy of Exporting Democracy, and Doing Bad by Doing Good, Why Humanitarian Action Fails. Dr. Coyne is also a recipient of the 2007 Fund for the Study of Spontaneous Order Award, awarded by the Atlas Economic Research Foundation, and in 2008 he was named the Hayek Fellow at the London School of Economics. His main areas of interest include Austrian economics, economic development, and political economy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Coyne for his lecture on the fatal conceit of foreign intervention.
Thank you very much. This is my first time to Hillsdale, actually, and I've been around Hillsdale students for years now, all the way back from when I was a graduate student at George Mason, all the way to now. We have my colleague Peter Leeson was a student here, of course, and we have several students in our program who are graduates of Hillsdale, so it's a pleasure to finally get to come visit campus. So what I'm going to talk about today is foreign intervention, and to kind of give away the punchline up front, I'm a skeptic of foreign intervention, and more specifically U.S. foreign intervention. And hopefully by the time I'm done, I have provided a convincing case for you to be skeptical as well. My skepticism is not based on any kind of normative or moral argument for why the U.S. government should not intervene abroad. And it's not that I don't think those issues are important. Instead, as an economist, I have no special kind of knowledge of those arguments. So that's for the realm of philosophy and ethics. So, there's these debates over just war theory and when people have a moral obligation to intervene and whatnot. But what I want to focus on is the positive aspects. In other words, the kind of economics of foreign intervention, or the political economy of foreign intervention. And I think once we take into account those constraints, both the epistemic or knowledge constraints and the incentives at work, as well as the incentives that are created in terms of what type of people are attracted to foreign interventions, is a strong case for leaning towards non-intervention. I'm going to proceed in 4 sections. I'm going to give you an introduction and provide some background and context and define some terminology. I'm going to provide 6 parallels between what I call the fatal conceit of foreign intervention and Hayek's fatal conceit of socialism. I'm going to spend a little bit of time, as I mentioned, talking about the type of mindset that is required for successful foreign intervention, and I'll sum up, and then we can talk about whatever it is you want to talk about. So kind of to give you some background, The Fatal Conceit is Hayek's last book. It was published in 1988, and for those kind of students that are interested in history of thought or Austrian economics, there's debate about how much Hayek wrote of this book or how much he didn't, because he was elderly and sickly. That's irrelevant for my argument. All I need is these kind of 2 quotes, and that's what I want to focus on. The fatal conceit, the core idea, which is an idea that Hayek really was getting at throughout his entire body of work in some sense, was what are the limits of human reason? More specifically, what are the limits of human reason in designing the world the way we want to design it? So we can imagine many different states of the world which we think are preferable to the status quo. The question, of course, is can we then design policies, design institutions to achieve those ends? So the fatal conceit, Hayek said, again focused on socialism, is the kind of view that we can shape the world according to our wishes and desires. And he said, look, our role as economists is to place parameters on these utopias, to point out what the limits are in achieving the various outcomes that we can envision as possibilities. In other words, it is to provide insight into what actually can be achieved in practice. So the normative is, what should we do? Right? Lots of people say this. We must do something to help people that are starving. We must do something to help people that are suffering under brutal dictators. Following the earthquake in Haiti in 2010, we must do something to help them. The economist says, well, wait. The question we need to be asking is, what can we do? And of course, while economics cannot answer moral questions, normative questions, it can inform those discussions. Because things that at first might appear to have moral weight may not have moral weight once we take into account the constraints we face. To state this slightly differently, if you said, well, we have a moral obligation to do X, and the economist is able to say to you, look, if you do X, there is a high likelihood that you will generate more harm than good, then you probably don't want to do X, unless your goal is to hurt people. If your goal is to help them, and you're going to generate more harm than good, you want to refrain from that action. That is the role of economics. So here's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about how the logic of the fatal conceit applies to foreign intervention. And I want to define foreign intervention as broadly as possible, because I want it to include as many things as possible. And if we want, during the Q&A, we can drill down on that and talk about specific cases, but for now I'm going to keep it broad. And foreign intervention, in my definition, is simply the use of discretionary power by one government to attempt to effect change in another society. So it is an intervention in another society, the US government or a collection of governments intervening in another society to achieve some desired outcome. And the fatal conceit is exactly what Hayek said it is. It is the idea that when we push beyond the boundaries of human reason, we run into problems. And if you think about most government interventions, even ones that are pitched as being really simple, more often than not, they devolve into very complex interventions. And typically, even very simple ones, like delivering short-term humanitarian aid, are interwoven with much more complex ones. So think about Haiti. The US government said we're going to deliver short-term humanitarian aid, water. You say that's not beyond human reason, but what's the rest of the intervention? We're going to build it back better. We're going to rebuild the country better than it was before. I want to argue that is beyond human reason. Now, most discussions completely neglect any focus at all on constraints. This goes for many academics, by the way, but especially for politicians and policymakers. Let me give you a very blunt example, because every once in a while, politicians, well, more than every once in a while, more often than not, they are kind of clear in their ignorance of basic economics. Hillary Clinton, this is in front of the Council on Foreign Relations, then Secretary of State Clinton. Americans have always risen to the challenge. That's who we are. It's in our DNA. There are no limits on what we can do. No constraints. Now you say, well, that's just political rhetoric. She's talking about foreign policy. Okay? How many of you have heard politicians say something like, we sent a man to the moon, therefore we can do X, and then they insert some grandiose plan in here, as if those two things somehow equate to each other. But you get the point, right? So as I mentioned at the outset, these are the three things I want to focus on today. The incentives at work, the epistemic constraints, and the interventionist mindset. What you need to kind of think in terms of in order to both make arguments for foreign interventions and actually to carry them out. So 6 parallels. I'm going to go through each, I'll give you a couple examples, and I'll move through at a pretty quick pace. Number 1. One of the basic insights of economics, which you all know, is that intentions don't equal results. Wishing something so does not make it so. When it comes to foreign policy, this goes out the window. People make grandiose claims of what can be accomplished, what they claim can be accomplished, and then they attempt to do it. And more often than not, there's no discussion of potential unintended consequences whatsoever, or how they're going to be addressed when they do occur. So there's not even a recognition that they might occur. In other words, there's extreme confidence in the ability to actually achieve the results you say you can. And there's no discussion of the adaptability of the system. In other words, when bad, unintended stuff happens, how are we going to address it? Economists fall prey to this all the time. Let me give you a couple very blunt examples. This is from Paul Collier. Paul Collier is an economist at Oxford. He's a development economist. And for any of you who are interested in development economics, and this is kind of a very distilled version, there's basically 2 sides of the foreign aid debate. In these, again, I'm dumbing it down just for the sake of 10 seconds. People who are proponents and people that are opponents. It works or it doesn't work. Typically, in this very distilled form, Jeff Sachs at Columbia University falls on the side of it works, we just need more effort and resources and planning. Bill Easterly at New York University is kind of pitched as the guy that's anti-foreign aid. Whether that's too kind of a stark distinction, right, or extreme, let's just put aside, that's how people view it. Paul Collier is viewed as the guy in the middle. The reason why is because he says, look, these guys are ideologues. You have the lefty, you have the righty. I'm the guy in the middle because I don't have an ideology. I have econometrics. I have the data, and I only listen to the data. I let the data speak. And he says, I run the regressions, and they tell me, and it removes all bias from it because I'm not interjecting my view. The problem, of course, though, well, there's multiple problems, but one of the problems is if you actually look at meta-studies on data, so there's meta-studies, one was just released in the Journal of Development Studies. They look at all 68 empirical papers on foreign aid, the same 68. One back in 2008 in the European Journal of Political Economy says no evidence that foreign aid works for growth. Someone just released in the Journal of Development Studies looking at the same 68 studies and says it works. How can you have the same empirical studies, one person saying they work and one they don't? And how do we resolve that? Can't be empirics in this case because empirics is showing both sides of the debate. We're using the same exact findings. I would like to argue that economic theory can help us place parameters on it. But returning to Collier, what does he say? Aid's not effective in inducing turnaround in a failing state. You wait for the political opportunity. When it arises, you pour in assistance as quickly as possible. After a few years, you pour in money for the government to spend. What are the assumptions here? Well, there's several. Number one, donor governments, the United States, can turn on aid like a faucet at exactly the right time. Anyone that has followed politics in the United States knows it doesn't work like that. We can't pass a budget for our own country. We can't figure out healthcare, how to reform Social Security, education, and so on and so forth, let alone figuring out whatever the right political opportunity is. What else? No discussion of the unintended consequences in the other country. The fact that you actually might do more harm than good, which there are real arguments for. Think about it. If you have, for instance, a very corrupt country, what happens when you dump millions of dollars of aid into that corrupt country? The idea is it will be used to reform the government. Of course, the fundamental dilemma here is that a country that is able to effectively use aid wouldn't need it, right? Because it already have the country that has state capacity to use it effectively doesn't need it. A country that needs it doesn't have the state capacity to use it correctly. That's the fundamental dilemma. But Collier goes even further, because here you might say, okay, we waste some money on aid, even though aid can do real harm and harm innocent people that are already suffering. It gets worse. Let's go to military intervention. Securities requires an external military presence for a long term. How long time? How long time? We can use statistics to determine exactly how long. Sending and recipient governments should expect the presence to last around a decade. So it's 1 decade exactly. Much less, domestic politicians, they'll play the waiting game. Much more, citizens won't like the fact that troops are there for more than a decade. So 1 decade exactly. Right away, you should say, wait a minute. Again, what gives you any kind of confidence that, number one, we know the right amount of troops to send in, how to allocate those scarce resources correctly to get the desired end, and then pull them out at exactly a decade? That's the US side, or whatever government. He's advocating the US and international organizations. And what gives you confidence that they're going to do what we want them to do over there, they have the knowledge to accomplish the ends, and that the people in the occupied country are going to react as if they're pieces on a chessboard that can just be moved around as long as you and I want, as the designers of the grand plan. Of course, again, one of the insights of basic economics is people respond to incentives. What incentives does having foreign troops in your country create? And how do people respond? That's the discussion we want to have. Number two, reliance on top-down planning. The foreign intelligence, the national security community complex, if you will, has more experts than they know what to do with. Everyone's a supposed expert on national security and has very clear arguments about what they should do. Just flip through the various cable channels talking about Russia right now, and you'll see lots of different opinions on what we should do, right? What government should do. But here's the problem. What's the assumption? The supposed experts know how to design the relevant institutions and how to design the allocation of resources within those given institutions. You need to assume this in order to achieve the desired end. If you say, we can bring liberty to Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, what's the assumption? You know how to bring liberty to other countries, whatever that is defined, and you can actually design it and implement it exactly the way you want. And there's other assumptions as well, which I'll talk about in a moment. So let's talk about this for a moment. Again, politicians like to point out repeatedly that for the first time in history, they know how to do something. And we can find lots of examples of this. Woodrow Wilson, this is the League of Nations. For the first time in history, the councils of mankind are to be drawn together and concerted for the purpose of improving the conditions of working people. So, Woodrow Wilson either didn't have the knowledge or was a jokester, because in 1949, Harry Truman in his famous four-point speech, his inaugural address, said the same thing. Now, for the first time in history, humanity possesses the knowledge and skills to relieve suffering. Many people, of course, attribute kind of the origins of U.S. foreign aid to this, even though, of course, we can see at least the spirit of it earlier, in the earlier 1900s with Wilson. But that's not the end of it. Millennium Development Corporation under George W. Bush. Now we're going to get foreign aid right, because this time we figured it out. And don't take my word for it. Today, not only do we have the financial resources to end extreme poverty once and for all, but we have the technological knowledge and know-how. So now we know how to do it in 2000. There's more, though. The knowledge problem, as you know it, from those of you who have taken economics, you tend to think of it in this kind of context, within a given set of institutions. So within a given set of political and economic institutions, can central planners rationally allocate resources to their highest value use? That's the socialist calculation debate, right? The debate about the best means of organizing economic activity. In its pure or idealized form, the initial debate was, well, should we nationalize the means of production? That was kind of the socialist side, right? Which of course changed over time as they kind of eased up on those assumptions and said, okay, we'll allow some markets. This was market socialism. We'll allow markets in final consumer goods, but we'll still have control over the production of goods. By that I mean state control. And of course, Mises and Hayek argued for the importance of private property and the subsequent prices. Again, not on normative grounds that private property and prices were inherently good in some moral sense, but because of a purely positive technological argument, which is a technical economic argument, which was how will you judge the opportunity cost or alternative use of resources outside of the context of markets. Now here's why this is important. What does economic planning for development attempt to do? Generate development through central planning. What is foreign aid? Well, those people over there don't save enough because they're stuck in a poverty trap. What does that mean? Well, if you're living at subsistence levels, you're consuming what you produce, you can't save because you're consuming everything. What does economic development entail? Well, it entails some form of capital, which entails foregone consumption. You can then use that capital to increase production processes to yield greater output in future periods. Right? That's kind of development in a nutshell, if you will. Well, if you can't save, you can't get capital and the process never takes off. So the fundamental idea was that external countries, wealthy countries, can inject savings into poor countries, and then those poor people will have capital. They can consume at their subsistence level and then invest the capital and you'll get takeoff. That was the idea. How much money do you give? How do you allocate it? Governments are involved. They typically pick winners. We want to invest in this industry or that industry. How do you do that? That's much closer to the socialist side of the calculation debate than the Mises-Hayek debate, side of the debate, which was, look, create broad rules that enforce property rights and then allow people to engage in experimentation and discovery so that they can figure out the best use of resources. So one's kind of using the plans of experts from outside. The other is relying on the individuals themselves within a certain institutional regime. But that just forces the problem up a level to the meta rules themselves. And this is what a lot of economists don't talk about. Can we design the foundations of a free society? That's a big question. We know it's not really easy, because if it was really easy, we wouldn't have had to invade Iraq and Afghanistan. Here's what we would do. We'd go where I'm from, you'd get on the metro, go into DC to the museum shop, you drop $10 on a replica of the US Constitution, and you just mail it over to other countries and say, just follow the rules here, they work pretty well for us for a little while. So, you can have that too. But you know that wouldn't work. Why? Well, because the rules that stick or operate in a certain manner here wouldn't operate there. Why? Because they don't like certain things? No, because what? They have different histories, different traditions, what Hayek called the extended order of society. The extended order of society is the array of historical experiences, the array of norms, culture, belief systems that allow formal organizations to operate as they do. Which means you just can't pick up formal institutions or organizations and drop them wherever you want. And here's the thing, and we should just admit this as social scientists. It's okay to say we don't know certain stuff. We don't know how to go into other societies and rebuild them. Political scientists do not know how to build political institutions. Economists do not know how to build economic institutions. Legal scholars do not know how to build legal institutions from the ground up in the way they want to. It's not that we have no knowledge at all, right? We know broad things. Private property rights matter. That doesn't mean you can just go jam them wherever you want to in the exact form you want to, because they won't stick or operate as desired. Keep that in mind, because I'm going to show you examples later on of the exact opposite. And ignorance of history and context. Again, Hayek pointed out that we have to appreciate the extended order, which is beyond the scope of human reason. This is why Hayek argued that attempts to perfect man would lead to disastrous consequences, because in ignoring the broader array of traditions, norms, and so on that allowed society to operate, you would destroy them, which would lead to great costs on ordinary citizens. Why does this matter for today? Well, let's think about Afghanistan for a second. If you were going to occupy a country and attempt to impose institutions, or implement, or provide, if we want to use gentler language, maybe a good starting point would be what? To read a history book, right? Can we all agree that would be a good, or maybe Google, Wikipedia? You say you're being snarky. No, I'm not. I'm just talking about who the person in charge said, which is I didn't bother looking at Wikipedia. And no one else did either. By the way, many people think of kind of the U.S. involvement of Afghanistan prior to this being back at the Soviet war and right, with the origins of the Taliban, which we helped create in the previous intervention. But back in the 60s, the U.S. was involved in Afghanistan as well, something called the Helmand Valley Project. And this isn't I'm not making this up. It was literally, the idea was to bring a little America to Afghanistan. Again, talking about kind of intervening and imposing one view. That was how the project was pitched. We're going to build little America over there. New York Times, I think it's 1960, it's a headline. Helmand Valley Project suffers from a comedy of errors. You can Google this and look it up. It takes you 2 seconds. You don't even need to be an expert in the region. And it talks about economics in there. All the stuff you guys know. Not in those economic terms, but if you're an economist, you read it, it says, boy, there's really expensive tractors, state-of-the-art tractors that the United States sent over that are sitting there rusting. How can this be? Oh, well, they forgot to take into account the human element, right? That's what you and I would talk about in terms of constraints. And they talk about knowledge problems. Well, people don't know how to use them correctly, and they don't have spare parts, so when they break down, they don't know how to fix them. Right? Again, as economists, we understand all this stuff. But it doesn't even get to the point of Googling that and trying to understand it. It's intervene first, we must do something, and then say oops later when it doesn't work out. And then we just regroup for the next round. And then we couch it in terms of language of lessons learned, next time will be different. Parallel 4, the primacy of collectivism over individualism. Hayek pointed out that one of the core characteristics of socialism was the reliance on collectivism, the need for the individual to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. It's the same exact thing when it comes to foreign intervention, if you think about it. As you listen to people talk about foreign intervention, whether it's academics, whether it is politicians, pundits, listen to the language they use. You'll hear a lot of we, them, right? Very rarely do you hear people, individuals. Whether it's individuals who are carrying out the intervention themselves or individuals in the other countries. You'll hear talk of national goals, some notion of social welfare at a global level. We need to pursue the global good or the national good. All of this smacks of collectivism. One clear example of this is something I mentioned already, which is the Millennium Development Goals. It's a list of 8 goals. Most people wouldn't disagree with them. It says things like, cut prevalence of HIV in half, enroll more kids in school. You'll say those are all nice things. Just take a read through them. Nowhere in there does it say things like protect private property rights, let people choose what they want to do, right? That sounds like a good thing. Which again goes back to the foreign aid point with state capacity, right? You'll hear government officials in other countries say we need foreign aid in order to reform our governments. The answer to this is no, you don't. You don't need foreign aid to reform your government. Here's a much easier thing to do. Take your hands and stick them in your pockets. Stop taking people's stuff and stop hitting people and taking their stuff, right? You can constrain yourself. And if you can't control yourself, then you shouldn't have lots of money. That's what you can do. And they'll say no, because other people will do it. Well, again, they can stop doing it as well. If they're truly committed, it seems like there's a much easier way to facilitate development. I won't spend time reading through these, but look, we cannot do this. We must do this. It's all we. This one sums up the Haiti perfectly. Talk about arrogance. There's a silver lining. You've all heard of the broken window fallacy, right? This is like a whole new variant of that. A silver line to the Haiti earthquake. We can put them back together the way we want to. So there's them, the little Haitian people that don't know any better, and we've been trying to fix them for a long time and we can't. And there's us, the enlightened people. And now we can finally fix them the way we want to. That's the mentality, right? Number 5, the reliance on politics to allocate resources. I already hinted this with the knowledge problem, but there's other aspects to it. It's not just reliance on politics, it's reliance on a massive bureaucratic apparatus that's oftentimes linked in with private interests that benefit from the government monopoly on national security and the rents that accrue. And that leads to what? Well, you all know how bureaucracies operate. You all know that they have the incentive to spend down their budgets, because if they don't, they suffer budgetary losses. You know they have an incentive to expand the number of subordinates. That's how they get more money as well as spending all their money. And you know they create demand for their own goods. In other words, they have to constantly point out new challenges that they need to address. The natural tendencies of government agencies is to expand their portfolio of activities, not to shrink it. On top of it, as I mentioned, it leads to massive rent seeking. Let me provide you a couple of examples. You can look at any report on Iraq and Afghanistan and see massive amounts of waste with no one held accountable at all. Again, basic economics. When you're not accountable for your actions, do you expect people to engage in more risky behavior or less? Right? In some sense, this shouldn't be surprising at all. Same thing with Haiti. And there's many other examples as well of just waste. And it's not, again, a zero effect. It's not like we're just burning money, even though in some cases we are. In some cases, the money ends up in the hands of people that are doing harm to ordinary people that cannot defend themselves. But if you're not focused on individuals, you neglect that. You're not worried about that. It's the them, right? It's not people. The military-industrial complex. Crazy libertarian conspiracy? No. Eisenhower warned about it. People like to point out, many economists, that national defense, national security is a public good. Well, this assumes, of course, that it's a good. The government's actually producing stuff that's doing something good. I'm not talking about harming people. I'm talking about actually producing stuff that will provide defense. Who knows best what we need for defense? I'm guessing the military. If we truly believe that the military is good at their job, their comparative advantage is in providing defense, right? Engaging in force or the threat thereof. That's why we want them. So we should listen to the military. If they say we don't need something, we probably shouldn't produce it anymore. It doesn't work that way. Tanks. Now we're in the age of what? Well, even with the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan, it wasn't like traditional wars where you rolled in the tanks, took over, right, and occupied the country like we used to. Dispersed insurgencies, drone warfare. In other words, warfare has changed over the last several decades. The army says we don't need tanks anymore, right? Congress says, well, you better like them because you're getting them. How can this be the case? If they are civil servants if they are protecting us, if government must provide national defense, because economists, after all, say it's a public good, how can this be possible? Well, you all know how it's possible, which is private interests, industry, benefits greatly from the perpetuation of inefficient programs. I'm not going to read this to you. BAE is the company, I think it's in York, Pennsylvania. And they basically want to keep producing and refurbishing the tanks because they don't want to lose jobs. And Congress is very happy to go along with this. So what do you get? You get military Keynesianism, the idea that we can stimulate economic development and growth through spending on the military, combined with the production of equipment that is actually not providing defense at all, that's not needed. Not based on my insight, because I have no special insight about what's needed for national defense, based on the people that should know, members of the military. The rejection of complex phenomena. This is parallel number 6. Society is characterized by complex systems. Complex systems are systems that are characterized by a series of interrelated units, and those interrelated units are such that when you intervene in one part of the system, you have effects in other parts of the system which you can't anticipate. Moreover, another characteristic of complex systems is that the overall order looks different than any of the constituent parts. The market is the standard example of this, right? What do we talk about? The market is really an outcome of the interaction of millions of buyers and sellers, and we talk about how people pursue their own ends, and it generates a broader order. That if we step back and look from kind of a meta level, it looks desirable. But we say, look, the individuals don't even need to know what's going on. They're just pursuing their own interests, and they contribute to that broader order. That same logic characterizes legal systems, political systems, as well as economic systems. This has important implications because when you appreciate complex systems, if you appreciate it, right away you should be very humble about intervening to fix things. Because you say, wait, I can't understand this. And even if I can understand it, I'm going to generate unintended consequences. Well, how confident are you then that politicians can respond to unintended consequences? Well, think about the tanks. They're not going to be very responsive because there's going to be other interests pushing back. Let me give you 2 very blunt examples. This is from the Stability Operations Guide. It's basically the guide that's given to members of the U.S. military in post-conflict situations. This is the way that politicians, that even members of the military, view complex systems, as if they are a linear engineering problem. You want an economy? No problem. Build some infrastructure, create a workforce, get some natural resources managed, build Wall Street, stop black market activity, stir it, there you go. Democracy, 5 steps, right? There you go. This is linear thinking. It is A plus B equals C. In a certain order, you can get the outcome you want. This is not how the world operates. Even if you step back, though, and think about any one of these, it's unclear that anyone has the knowledge actually how to accomplish it. So, for instance, this, black markets. Economists have studied black markets. We know why black markets exist, right? Black market's not inherently bad. It's that you've made something illegal and it's been pushed underground, right? That's why black markets exist. How do you get rid of them? Remove barriers to trading. Legalize it, right? But that's hard to do in practice. Again, we know in the broad sense what it takes, but actually accomplishing it, right, is more difficult. But there's another problem here. Who is tasked with carrying this out? Members of the U.S. military. Do you think members of the U.S. military have a comparative advantage in promoting free media? No. So I actually feel very bad for them in some sense. They're trained to do a very specific task, and maybe they're good at it, maybe they're not. Depends on their training and personal characteristics. But I know, or at least I'm pretty confident, that this does not characterize how most people think of members of the U.S. military. But this is what's required of them. But it gets even more bizarre. And if I had to show one slide that kind of summarizes the absurdity of foreign intervention, it would be the next one, which is this. This is the 30th PowerPoint slide. It's the final one, including the cover slide. And this was declassified, but this is one of the plans that was discussed for Afghanistan. And you say, well, wait a minute, Coyne. You said beliefs are important, they wrote the word there. You said infrastructure is important, they wrote that word, so it seems like they got everything down. But this is the kind of mentality. We can hire a McKinsey consulting firm that has somewhat fancy PowerPoint skills, because actually this isn't good PowerPoint skills if you know what good PowerPoint skills are. Well, it's kind of impressive they put it together, but in terms of following it, it's not impressive. But what does this tell us? Can you capture an entire, it's like, okay, follow these steps and you'll get a new Afghanistan. That's the kind of logic that we have. Yet people are increasingly, or continually shocked when these things tend to go wrong. You should ask just the opposite. You've all stood in lines at the US Post Office. You have all stood in lines at the DMV. You have all stood in lines at TSA. Now, take that and ramp it up magnitudes of thousands, and then ask yourself why you would ever expect it to work. Because that's really what it is. And I'm going to come back to that at the end, because when it comes to foreign policy, lots of people like to do this two-step where they pretend that somehow when you go abroad, all those things go away. All the problems we face domestically, somehow they don't exist anymore. And that's a big issue. So let's move on to the interventionist mindset. Here's the thing. I'm not judging agent type, by the way. And what I mean by that is I'm not going to say some people are good or bad. I don't know the people involved. I'm sure there's some that are good people, bad, whatever, however we define that. All I want to point out is that when you engage in foreign intervention and advocate for it, it requires a certain type of person, both to advocate for it and to actually carry it out. And what you need to think about, if you're an advocate of this, or when you're thinking through current events, is do you want these type of people involved? You might. I'm not trying to make an argument that you never want these type of person with these characteristics. It's not that all 12 hold, and there might be other ones I didn't think of, but these are kind of the common ones I've seen as I've been reading a lot, both in terms of the way people talk about foreign intervention and those involved. So if you read Robert Gates' memoir, Duty, you'll see a lot of these characteristics of Gates himself or of other people. Here we go. Number one, extremely confident in their ability to solve complex problems. In order to say we should intervene over there and do this, you have to be confident that you can solve complex problems, that you can solve the problems that plague entire societies, or you wouldn't say, we need to do this. So that's number one. Number two, possesses an extreme sense of superiority. You have to think that somehow you have the magical key to scientific knowledge that other people don't. That's the ability to rationalize it, and that you are righteous. You are morally superior in recommending that the US government or a collection of governments use its coercive discretionary power to implement these things in other societies. Related, the advocate of foreign intervention is extremely judgmental of other people. Again, you have to be. I don't like what's going on over there. I don't like what they're doing. I like what I think should be going on more. So I want to do it over there. Number four, related, feels comfortable imposing their preferences on other people. Not only do I dislike what you're doing, and I like what I'm doing, we think that all the time. We judge people all the time for better or worse in our heads. We say, I don't like what you're doing, I would do it this way. But it's even worse, because you have to feel justified imposing your preferences on other people. What type of person feels comfortable imposing their preferences on others? That's what you need to think about. Number five, has to be extremely comfortable and confident, as I mentioned, a massive bureaucracy. Massive. Because intervening abroad entails not just one agency, but dozens of agencies. And then when you move internationally, take a look at the United Nations organizational chart. And then involve them as well, or the IMF, or the World Bank. And think about how many layers of bureaucracy are involved in that. Then you link in the private interest, the logic of special interest groups that are going to continually attempt to shape and manipulate this for their own benefits. The advocate of foreign intervention has to believe that they're immune, that their plan is somehow immune from that. This is the Paul Collier position. I can keep it a military, have them intervene right at the right time, and exit right at the right time. And they will do exactly the right thing to provide national security in a weak and failed state. Number six, lack sympathy towards others. And you say, well, wait, if they're intervening because they're righteous, how do they lack sympathy towards others? What happens when people in other countries, when the US or other governments intervene, when they reject it? They're either insurgents or they're ungrateful. So you'll hear lots of people say, well, we gave people in Iraq and Afghanistan the opportunity to be free, now it's up to them. As if they somehow should be happy that we did that. And if they're not, it's on them. It's never on us. Right? What about what they think? Maybe, perhaps they view the world differently. Perhaps they view someone intervening with guns as not being a good opportunity for them to have freedom. Number 7, excludes the costs imposed on those being intervened upon. In other words, they cut the cost-benefit analysis short. You hear discussions of Iraq. This is what you'll typically hear from U.S. politicians or pundits. 4,400 deaths, right? 4,400 to 4,500, that's U.S. deaths. What does that exclude? Well, the over 100,000, well, in Iraqi deaths, we don't have a good estimate. It's somewhere in the 100,000. I've seen up to 500,000 estimated. Let's stick at the lower bound and say it's 100,000, just because I don't have a better number, so we'll go with the lower one. That's what we need to take into account. If you view humans as human, as individuals, you have to say, look, we did it, but we killed 100,000 people. You might still say it's net benefit, but you need a full cost accounting. Just saw a post yesterday, the headline yesterday in the Washington Post when I was taking a look before when I was packing to come here. The article is about how now the U.S. is leaving, it created training areas for its troops in Afghanistan, and there's explosives in the ground. Who plays there? Kids. Kids blow up. Now, 80 to 100 so far. That's part of the cost. You need to take into account that you're comfortable with that. Again, you might come to the conclusion that you are. I'm not making that decision for you. But you can't just say, these are the costs on the U.S. in terms of deaths and that's it. Right? Because we're making a broader argument about individuals. And we can't exclude certain individuals from the cost-benefit analysis. Understates the monetary costs on the citizens of the intervening country. Think about Donald Rumsfeld in Iraq. What were the claims? What did he ask for? Like 20 billion or something like that, and then said oil would pay for the rest. What else did he say? 6 days, 6 weeks, 6 months max we'd be there. All right? 6 months max. Completely underestimates the monetary costs. Why? We all know this. What happens when you don't incur the cost and you're spending other people's money? Exactly what you would expect to happen. Right? So you understate it to justify the intervention, and then when it doesn't happen, it's not like we're sending Donald Rumsfeld the bill. Right? No, he's making like a documentary for HBO. Number 9, embraces an unwavering sense of nationalism. The military, at least in the United States, I don't want to talk about other countries, if you question the military, it is one of like the worst things you can do. So I'll talk about this stuff oftentimes, and people will say, un-American, you don't support the troops. Right? It's like, what? I don't understand. It's the exact opposite. I don't want to put people in harm's way when they can't do things. It seems to me that just sending people around the world and asking them to do that whole list of things without appreciating what can be accomplished in practice is much more dangerous to their well-being and the well-being of other innocent citizens than actually stepping back and asking. But what happens? Why do people tend to do this? Well, it disarms you, right? No pun intended. Disarms you. What happens? If someone calls you un-American, you don't support the soldiers, it puts you in a position where it's almost impossible to debate because you look like a bad person no matter what you say at that point, unless you say, hey, you're right, I support it. Right? So it makes it very difficult to argue against it. But that's kind of the view that's prevalent. You can't have a level-headed discussion of the relevant constraints that are at play. Number 10, publicly condemns other governments for doing the same exact thing. John Kerry just a couple weeks ago. President Obama saying, in Iraq we tried to get international approval. Russia didn't try that. We tried. We didn't get it, but we tried, so that's enough. Or when the U.S. was in Iraq and Iran was trying to influence what happened, remember the U.S. got really mad. How dare you, Iranian government, try to influence the outcome of what's happening here? With no recognition of the irony that we were doing the same exact thing. Why? Because a sense of superiority and righteousness. If what I'm doing is right, and I know it, and I'm unwavering in my confidence of it, then by definition, everyone else does is wrong. That goes against what I want, because I know I'm right. Number 11, lacks self-awareness. You don't hear General McChrystal, when he says, we didn't pay attention to history, say, yeah, this is a really messed up system. We probably shouldn't do this anymore. That would be self-awareness. Something's really wrong here. How can it be that we didn't read a book? That's really problematic. No, we just need to do better next time. I just was reading a report the other day on lessons learned from Iraq, and it's the same broad implications that mean everything and nothing. We need better coordination, better transparency and accountability. What does this mean? I like those words. I know what each word means, but in terms of actually doing something, it's unclear what any of those things mean in terms of overcoming these constraints, in terms of recognizing limits on human reason, instead in terms of stepping back and saying, what do we actually know about this? What can we do? And it's not zero, by the way, but it's also not going to the extreme of everything. And finally, ignores the non-monetary costs of interventions on the composition and dynamics of domestic political institutions. People tend to think that we need national security and defense in order to protect domestic institutions. But here's a question for you, and I'm going to come back to this at the end, so I'm not going to spend much time on it here. What happens if intervening abroad eroded the very institutions at home that they were intended to protect? What if they undermine the very liberties that they're supposed to be protecting? That seems like an important question, rather than just assuming that, well, whatever we're doing abroad must be good and must reinforce those institutions. By the way, this view isn't original to me. I'm going to come back to that in my final point. So why does this matter? Well, if you want to critically assess foreign policy, it seems we want to take into account what type of people are going to be attracted to it. And you need to ask yourself, do you want those kind of people being attracted? Someone with those type of characteristics? Again, you might, depending on the type of intervention. But when people are claiming, well, our goal is to spread freedom, to spread liberty, to spread democracy, do those characteristics align with that goal? That's what you need to ask. And you'll say, well, no, that's what politicians just say. Well, in that case, you should by default be against foreign intervention because that means you're admitting they're liars. And having a liar run around the world with guns is probably not a prudent strategy. So summing up, my point in some sense is a simple one. Hopefully, if you haven't already, and I hope you do, because again, I don't know why people somehow think international relations is outside the purview of economics. To me, it's an economic issue, which is the same exact issues that apply domestically, we should be applying there. So every discussion of all foreign policy should be fundamentally grounded in economics. Methodological individualism, not nation states, because states don't act. People act within states. The incentives they face, the epistemic constraints they face, and economics in one lesson. There's the seen and the unseen. And if you just point out the seen, if you just say, well, we overthrew Gaddafi, therefore limited interventions can work. Well, you also created a humanitarian crisis in Mali, and you led to the flow of weapons out of Libya into Syria. That's the unseen, at least at the time of intervention, not to mention the civil war in Libya. Patterns versus point predictions. This comes right from Hayek. Hayek made the argument that economics allows us to make pattern predictions. The law of demand is a pattern prediction, right? It says something about the relationship between price and quantity demand, and if we hold other conditions constant. It doesn't get into magnitudes. Now, we can calculate magnitudes. That's the idea of elasticity, but of course, that's just an exercise in history, using historical prices. But it doesn't allow us to make specific point predictions about the future. And here's why this is important. Oftentimes, these are the kind of discussions that happen with foreign policy. Oh yeah? What about World War II, Japan and Germany? Gotcha. And then I'll say Somalia, and then they'll say this. And then I'm like, okay, we just said random cases back. Or if foreign aid, they'll say, we saved a kid over here with a vaccine. See, you're wrong. The argument is not that if you spend lots of money and keep trying, every once in a while good stuff will happen. I don't deny this, right? That's a fact. If you spend enough money on something and keep trying, every once in a while good stuff will happen. Here's what you have to ask yourself. Over the course of interventions, given what you know about the operation of government, given your knowledge of economics, how confident are you that it's going to be successful? Not every once in a while, but when people make claims, right? Remember the fundamental economic issue. At what cost? Right? People always forget this when it comes to foreign interventions. Think about it. If I said to you, or if I was teaching like principles of micro, and I had a student say to me, Professor Coyne, I'm trying to think about the post office, U.S. Post Office, their economics. And I'm like, okay, good. What am I looking for? Cost-benefit type reasoning. And they said, well, it's a success because mail gets to my mailbox every day, right? And I said, no, that's not the right way to think about it. What are you missing? And they say, no, mail gets to my mailbox every day. It's very good. Right? This is the argument, by the way, that Michael Moore used in his capitalism movie. Remember at the beginning he says, my father's received his Social Security check on time every month for the last 20 years. Government works. That fails economics 101 because the fundamental question is at what cost, right? It's not that you can do stuff. No one denies you can do things, right? It's that what do you pay to get it done? What's the cost? If the post office is going bankrupt, it's irrelevant that mail gets to your right? If you get $2 in benefits but it costs you $4, then it's irrelevant that it's getting there. It's a net cost. So that's economics, guys. How confident are you? Right? That's what you need to ask yourself. And finally, avoid the conservative two-step. Foreign intervention is a very controversial topic among people that are otherwise skeptical of government. Conservatives, even libertarians. But here's what I find quite odd. I'll talk to people and they'll say things like, I'll be like, what do you think of education? Government's terrible, get them out. What do you think about healthcare? Government's terrible, get them out. Post office, privatize it. What do you think about foreign policy? Need a strong foreign policy, need to intervene and fix them. What? There's like a magical, all of a sudden when we go internationally, magically, all the constraints on government are removed. And we assume the best of intentions on their part. We assume they're unconstrained, they can just do stuff. But here's what I want you to think about. If you're skeptical domestically, you should be skeptical plus internationally. And if you're not, by the way, you don't believe in limited government. Because what you should be arguing is that we should take that same military mindset and run all domestic institutions using it. If the US military and the entire apparatus that is associated with it is superior at doing all this stuff abroad, we can solve our problems easily. Don't like education? Militarize it. You don't like Social Security? Militarize it. If you're so confident that they can solve these other problems, it seems like we should just use that same logic and expand it out. But then notice what you've done. You can't be for limited government anymore. And there's something even more important. This comes back to my final point and then I'm done. This is from James Madison, okay, in 1795. Of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debt and taxes, armies and debts and taxes, and the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. In war, the discretionary power of the executive is extended, its influence in dealing out offices, honors, and emulations multiplied, and all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people. No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. That's Madison. It's not Coyne. This was my point about that last characteristic, which is you neglect the cost on domestic political institutions. Okay, this is 1795 in his political observations. That's what you need to think about. So if no society can maintain freedom and liberty in the wake of continuation of war, what do you say then to the permanent war economy which started after World War II? The idea that the US needs not just to prepare for immediate enemies, but to be in a continual state of preparation for potential enemies. What do you take to be the implications of the war on terror, which has no clear endpoint, a continuing war? What do you take into account to be the war on drugs, which again has no clear endpoint, which is a continuation of war? And just think about what the implications are domestically. Again, you might walk away and think to yourself, despite those costs, I still think we should do it. And at that point, we might disagree on the cost-benefit calculus. But all I want to impress upon you is to take into account the costs and to think through them. Because it's not just a matter of wasting money. It's a matter of harming innocent people abroad, doing harm to the very people we claim to be helping, and on top of it, potentially undermining the institutions at home that we all care about in terms of preserving our own freedom. Thank you very much. Any questions? Did you have your hand up? No. Oh, I thought you had your hand up before.
I guess what would you say to, for example, if you were debating a liberal, I guess, I mean, and they generally...
Peace out.
I guess, when they were talking about how they don't believe, kind of the opposite, I guess, that the liberals in a way, of having, of believing that foreign intervention is usually bad, and obviously the war in Iraq is a good example, and then all of a sudden they think that doing anything domestically, because we have good intentions, we're going to be able to do it. I know that's, so what is, I guess, the most direct way to show that if they believe in, I guess, against foreign intervention, that also domestically it's
Well, there's two things. First of all, I don't think liberals are against foreign intervention. I think right now in our political landscape, Republicans and liberals are the same.
Rachel Maddow, I guess for the documentary Hubris.
Mhm.
That was
I haven't seen it, but I know what you're talking about.
Okay. So it would just, I guess there's something to liberals that, mainly because the war in Iraq has kind of left a bad taste in their mouth, that they don't think we should do it right now.
Yes. It's funny you bring that up on one of the versions of this. I have a picture, what's the MSNBC motto, the pay it forward or lean forward? Pay it forward, lean forward. She's standing next to the Hoover Dam with the helmet. She's like, we did this, we can be a great country. And I have a picture of the reconstruction of Afghanistan. I'm like, what's the difference between these two things? Geographic location, right? And that's really the difference. So what would I point out? I'd focus on the same issues just domestically. All I'm doing in some sense is just taking the standard arguments that I would use in my skepticism of government programs domestically and trying to emphasize that it is magnitudes greater when we move internationally. And that somehow national borders, which are arbitrarily either designed or emerged, don't change that reality. So there's no like special secret to it. But again, liberals, basically the same. The problem now is if you say, this goes back to the nationalism point, if you say you are anti-intervention, somehow you're weak on security, you want terrorists to win, all this kind of stuff. That's a very hard position to argue from if people believe it because, it's like saying you hate kids or something like that. What do you, so, yeah.
So let's say that the United States was at a optimal level of foreign intervention, which is to say, hardly any at all from your standpoint. What exactly would that look like?
What would that look like? You're asking my opinion now.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me just say this is my opinion. That's why I want to make this clear to you. It's not some kind of, I'm not saying any other economists would agree with me. I'm not even talking to economists. It's purely my opinion. I don't think zero. It means that we are staying where you are, you guys, and everyone else. And maybe to the extent we had government, they would be protecting our borders. By that, you don't even need troops on the borders. You can now have minimal kinds of blimps, right, which are a variant of drones to surveil it. That's all you need. There's no clear threats to the United States that I can see. I know people pretend there are, but not that I know of. Again, there might be some kind of confidential information that I don't have, but North Korea, not a threat to the United States. Iran, not a threat to the United States. Could be a threat to other people in the world, but not to the United States. What else would it entail? My foreign policy would entail removing barriers to trade, and migration, which I think are the two easiest ways to help people, which is how I know that most people actually don't want to help foreigners, because when you ask them, they say, no, I don't want to do that, which means they like impoverishing people, right? If you explain it to them, if you are for trade barriers and preventing people from moving around, then you're not care about their well-being, or you do a lot less than you care about other things. Private charity would be going on, but I wouldn't have, if you just Google US bases around the world and look at the global footprint of the United States, if you Google and just say, where does the US have troops right now? And it's pretty much, not in every country, but in a lot of countries. It's very hard to make an argument that a majority of those cases are somehow benefiting you and I as citizens. I think they're benefiting certain groups of people, either domestically or internationally. So that would be my kind of strong position. Charles?
Could you clarify that more? Shut down embassies, close everything?
Yeah.
And also, U.S. Navy, for example, is a role for a Navy, or what is it? And the reason I'll ask this question, just to use something to chew on.
Mm-hmm.
I think if the United States Navy, for example, entirely withdraws from the world, it leaves a vacuum, and while I don't like U.S. intervention in most cases, I think Russian or Chinese dominance of the world would be far worse.
Then you're
the vacuum.
Yeah, so you would come down on the net benefit side. That's what, if you believe, if not you, but if you held that position. So what would happen? First of all, U.S. Navy, to the extent that it has a role, again, the word defense is not offense. That's the first thing to keep in mind, right? So defense means protecting U.S. citizens. The role of the U.S. Army, national security in the broadest sense, not just the Army, national security is to defend U.S. citizens. So what does defense entail? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. I don't think it entails worrying about other governments having power, whatever that means, right? We all know what the nature of government is. It's a predative monopoly on force, where thugs attempt to secure power for themselves. And that's not me being Mr. Libertarian, it's true. What's the constitutional project, guys? We don't want the thugs to have the power, so can we simultaneously empower the thugs and constrain the thugs? Because the thugs are going to get power. That's the constitutional power. It's the paradox of government, right? We're fortunate enough in the United States to have some notion of constraints on the thugs. In Russia, not so much. In other parts of the world, it's even worse in weak and failed states, right? So here's the thing you need to ask yourself, right? There's going to always be thugs in the world. Is us using our somewhat constitutionally constrained monopoly power a net benefit to us? And keep in mind what happens. The US government is constrained within the United States. They are not constrained when they intervene in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now you might say, no, there's the international community, there's treaties. The US government just ignores them when it's in their interest to do it. So when the US government intervenes abroad, it's acting as an unconstrained Leviathan. What do you expect to happen when an unconstrained Leviathan acts? They torture people. They kill innocent people. All the things we would expect government in its pure form to do. What the founding fathers expected them to do. That's why they wanted constraints on them. Now the question is, can you unleash that abroad to somehow check the power of other governments without it spilling back home? Without getting the rise of the NSA, which started, by the way, following the US occupation of the Philippines in the late 1800s. It wasn't called the NSA then, but that's the origins of the NSA. We were occupying a country, there were people that didn't like it, so we set up an entire surveillance apparatus to suppress insurgents. And then, when the war was over, the people that set up that apparatus came home to the US and set up a similar apparatus here. Or the militarization of police. What are SWAT teams, which arose in the 1960s? The use of military tactics abroad on US soil. You might say, well, the police have to fight bad people. Well, policing, in its origins, was to protect the life, liberty, and property of US citizens. The mission of the army is to destroy an enemy. If police become the military, then who is the enemy? That's the question you need to ask yourself. So, you might make these arguments, this type of thing, and I'm not downplaying it because I understand when people say it. I don't worry about foreign powers. I don't. Because I believe that economics offers insight into how to be a viable global player. Not that to me, that should even be the most important thing, right? To me, the most important thing is individual freedom. But that's how you also become a dominant power, because that's wealth creation. Allow people to create things and generate wealth and trade with people. So that's what I would do. I believe in unilateral trade with everyone, right? Because I don't believe government should set trade standards. I believe you and I as individuals should. So if you want to trade with people in North Korea or the government of North Korea, I think you should be able to. Same with Iran. I may not like you, I might think you're a despicable person for doing it, but that's individual choice. Yes, sir.
Yeah, kind of along that exact same line. How do you justify not worrying about other foreign governments and also legitimizing, free trade with everyone? Because along those lines.
How do I not worry about them?
Well, if you don't care about what they're doing and what they're doing in the world, then sometimes trade lanes could shut down, could be compromised because they're just dominating them. So how do you say that free trade is important, but also that we can't touch foreign governments because they could significantly influence those free trade markets?
Because here's the fundamental assumption. We need to go around the world and make the world safe for trade. This is what I view as free trade. What if I said this to you? Look, in our little group here, this is the economy, and I say, I'd like to trade with you, right? And someone bigger steps in front of me, doesn't touch me, but steps in front of me and says, I'd like to trade with you instead, and here's a better offer, right? And then I say, no, they just broke my trade lane up, right? Why do we care? Well, I don't think that, look, let's say Russia blocks a trade lane and won't let US trade with, pick a country, Ukraine. Okay, don't trade with the Ukraine. But that doesn't mean we intervene and blow them up, right? Which is really the alternative. I'm going to kill you if you don't let me trade with them.
Right, but there has to be something to do. We can't just be totally hands-off, I would assume.
Why?
Well, because it would, in that situation, it didn't totally cut it off, but would there be some circumstances that they could really leave us with no, desirable option where we would maybe have to?
They're going to surround the United States and not let any trade at all? I don't believe it. Look, most of these things are the thing, don't you worry about China, Russia, they're made up. It's like future states of the world. Do you worry about this happening, that happening? No, I don't. What I worry about happening is the erosion of freedom and liberty, which if you look at history, by the way, is much more common, right? Which is the US, to the extent we've held constitutional constraints on government, is a blip in the history of mankind. That's what I worry about, because that's much more fragile historically, right? But let's think about the worst case scenario. We can't trade with anyone externally. Again, I don't think that would, because I don't know how you block like Canada. But anyway, let's imagine this, that they put the fence around the US and we can't trade with anyone. Still got each other, my friend. We could trade it out. And so I don't worry about it. I really don't think these are concerns. I don't think these are major concerns. I also don't think the US government has us in its public interest when it goes abroad. Right? So clearing trade lanes all of a sudden becomes certain corporations lobbying for preferential treatment. Free trade agreements, you said? I think you said something about. Free trade agreements are very easy. Free trade agreements are like this thick. Does anyone know why? Because they're not free trade agreements. They're fake trade agreements. It is crony corporate capitalism under the guise of free trade. Here's free trade agreement. US citizens can trade with whoever they want. That's a free trade agreement. I wrote it, I can write it in 2 lines. So again, it's leave. Just stop. Government, defend. To the extent we have it, defend, let people do what they want. There's going to be rise in power, there's at any point in time, right? Think about this in terms of industrial organization. If I said to you at any point in time, oh my gosh, there's a monopoly there because that company has a really big market share, right? We need to break them up. Well, some people would say, yes, we need antitrust law. But other people might say, well, no, as long as there's contestable markets, as long as there's the threat of entry, they have no secure position on that power tomorrow, next year, next decade. So I'm not going to worry about it today. What I care about is kind of the interrelation of individuals. The broader, the better, right? The greater the extent of the market, the better, in competition. Yeah.
I think we're actually out of
Oh.
time. Sorry about
All right,
that.
well, thank you all very much. I'll be here for a couple minutes if you want to talk. Thank you.
Dr. Coyne.